All right, everyone. Excuse me. Well, welcome back. So, I just wanted to go over a few things today. Hopefully, you're primarily going to be studying for the exam on Wednesday. I've posted the study guide. I'll kind of go over that in a little bit. Excuse me. Also, just wanted to kind of, show where we're at and where we're going and what's going on and so on and so forth. So, just a reminder, this is really the only exam. It is the only exam that you have in this class. It is worth 20% of the grade, so it is fairly important in that regard. Packback 20%, so some of you who have not been on Packback, I've noticed, you need to get on there soon because you are losing points. And then coming up, we've got the research design, collecting raw data, and then the final paper. So we will have no class on Wednesday. Once again, there will be an exam. There will be 50 multiple choice questions. Some of them will be true and false. Most of the true and false questions will ask about a certain example of a study. The study looks at, the chemical industry in China, as well as the chemical industry in Russia, as well as it in North America or something like that. Is this an experiment? Is it a comparative historical analysis? Is it a survey? Is it a ethnography? Those kind of questions. So you'll see a number of kind of different examples of the different types of studies that are there. So let's see. I'm not going to go through all of this. So as I said, we'll be talking about the research design and then raw data. So research design, I'm going to, let's see, that'll be due on November 3rd. So you should be kind of thinking about it now. As I said, I'll be uploading papers that provide examples of different types of qualitative studies of the environment. I thought it would be good to wait till after the first exam, just so that we all, make sure we know the ABCs before we get on to the XYZs and so on. So, again, that's sort of where we are in the class, just getting down to the calendar itself. So last week, you read about the different types of qualitative research that has been done in California, specifically regarding the drought, as well as on the Mexican side of the Colorado River. And I enjoyed reading the different conversations and discussions on Packback about these studies in particular. So we are now going into week 4, and as you'll notice, the only readings are by this guy, Dr. Nielsen, chapter 3. So basically, this is the historical part of my own work that I would explain. So anyway, just to talk about the exam. So the exam will open at 1 a.m. It'll last till 11:59 p.m. As I said, multiple choice, some true and false. It will be online through Gaucho Space, so there won't be, any class on this coming Wednesday, just in case you need that time to take the exam. So once you're all rested from the exam and we come back, the next week I think is really when the class will start to get fun. Of course, Monday I'll just be lecturing, but what you should be doing then is thinking about what your study is, what kind of what research subject are you interested in? What can you look at from a qualitative perspective? Then you want to start thinking about a sample, and that'll become easier after you've done the readings and read the lectures. But then we move quite quickly because already by the next week we're wanting to do interviews, and I understand, sometimes these may go into the following week. We'll talk about that in the classroom in person. So we will, meet in class not this Wednesday, but next Wednesday, unless, well, we'll meet in class. I had this idea about meeting outside, and, that may or may not happen with depending on smoke and weather and whatnot. But anyway, for now, we'll meet in the class again next Wednesday. I will be sending out some things regarding setting up a research project. Okay, so looking at comparative historical methods, first wanted to show you, I'll be posting this. This is that article I discussed in class, History Repeats Itself, But How? City Character, Urban Tradition, excuse me, and the Accomplishments of Place. And this is by Harvey Mullich and the former Bill Freudenberg, where this is that study I talked about where they basically compared Ventura with Santa Barbara. And I'm trying to get to up to some of the some of the data that they show. So they have a map that they kind of included. It's something depending on your project, you may want to look at. Say you're looking at landfills, maybe you want to have a map of where the landfill is, or where an oil spill is, or whatever it might be. If you're looking at traffic or something. So that's one way that they present the data, and they've got these social and economic variables. This is, although it's dealing with numbers, this is still qualitative research because you're not really doing any causal analysis with those numbers. You're just kind of gathering them for descriptive purposes. So looking at median family income, college degree, maybe that has something to do with people's attitudes towards the environment. And then they get to the key part of their research, which is on oil development, and they talk about the differences between Santa Barbara and Ventura County, and how the oil industry tended to move over to Ventura County. You have the Derrick Room, a popular place to go in Ventura, in what was called the oil patch part. Again, they have towns. Sorry, I've got my cat trying to get my attention. So anyway, I think I mentioned this when the 101 was built through Ventura. It ended up cutting the city hall off from the beaches, and you didn't see that in Santa Barbara. In Santa Barbara, you had a much different approach to land use. You had a big parking garage and a Holiday Inn right on the beachfront in Ventura. You also look at changes that happened amongst the different job sectors. So you see mining to tourism, employment ratio, tourism here mainly, mining here mainly, the drilling of oil, other minerals and stuff like that. And you see a big drop, and pretty much it's dropping down to, Santa Barbara levels today. Far fewer people are reliant on the oil industry in Ventura County. And so then they contrast it with oil when it came to Santa Barbara, and some of the differences that appeared, and the different ways in which the communities and the cities responded to the development of the oil industry. So Santa Barbara, I did research on the city, and it pops up quite a bit in pop culture and various architecture and gardening magazines and so on and so forth. You don't quite see the same thing with Ventura yet. You may see something different. If you remember, don't mean to cause too many problems for your eyes, but you may remember that I had talked about how when the 101 came to Ventura, one way that Freudenberg and these other researchers did their comparative analysis was to look at letters to the editor. And so they looked at letters to the editor in Ventura, and in Ventura you had only one letter to the editor, whereas in Santa Barbara there were like 100 letters regarding the placement of the 101. So big difference in between two places that geographically aren't too far apart. Physically aren't too different, they're just small patches of land in between mountains and oceans, and so on. And so they took a bunch of pictures to show, give examples of what Ventura looks like and how it's hard to get to the beaches from the downtown. Whereas in Santa Barbara, as many of you know, they have a connection. There's that underpass. You can go underneath the 101 and walk from the downtown, or drive, or bicycle, or whatever you need to do in order to get out to the harbor, and so on. And then they've got the map of Santa Barbara, showing State Street and showing how State Street, the main street, connects the downtown to the beaches, to the harbor. So anyway, now other things they look at. So when environmental sociologists or social scientists are looking at this stuff, we're obviously not studying, ecosystems nearly as closely as environmental scientists and other biologists and conservation biologists might be doing, but we're looking at what is the economy and what is it that people do to make a living, and how does that impact the environment as well as the culture, and how does that culture impact the environment, and so on and so forth. Here you can see a big difference between Santa Barbara and other places. For one, if you can hear that, we've got an airport here. I'm near the airport right now. But you also see these two bars, one for revenues that the city's bringing in, another for assets. And then the number of voluntary organizations per 10,000 people in the city. So you see that Santa Barbara, bringing in way more revenue, has many more assets, properties, wealth, funds, that sort of thing at its disposal. Way more governmental, not governmental, voluntary organizations, meaning, you've got a community that's very much a community. It's very actively involved, actively engaged in making it what it is. Not so much in Ventura, and in fact you see far lower levels of revenue and assets. Again, 1995, some of this has changed. Ventura is doing better than it was then, but nonetheless, other things that's interesting. So I studied San Luis Obispo, and San Luis Obispo, it doesn't surprise me that they have almost as many of these types of organizations as Santa Barbara, because they are there's a very active, kind of environmentalist ethos there. But, they're not nearly as wealthy as Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara's the tourist resort out of all these places. Even though, remember, in Ventura you actually have, much longer beaches. You actually have less tar on the beaches. But, things sort of evolved the way they did. As I said, I'll post this just in case you're interested. They looked at other things such as health and human services and arts and culture. Again, Ventura, not so much. Santa Barbara, lots of health and human services. Wealthier people like to have, like to be taken care of. You also have way more money coming in from arts and culture. And again, this is 1995, so it's higher in both Ventura and Santa Barbara, but, Santa Barbara is still much, much higher. And then this is looking at number of businesses and services, just across a range of these different cities, and you see the ways in which they're comparing them. They've counted up museums and galleries, or numbers of businesses per 10,000 residents, museums, counseling services. Counseling services is kind of interesting in Santa Barbara. Does it mean that Santa Barbarans are just the most stressed out people, just so much more so than Ventura or Thousand Oaks or, Santa Maria? No, it means that people in Santa Barbara are more likely to be able to afford counseling services. Same thing with San Luis Obispo. Same thing with architectural services. Although Ventura is growing here, and I did a lot of research on their attempts at sustainable, or at least more sustainable construction. But again, I was really focused a lot on Santa Barbara and then San Luis Obispo, because they're both trying pretty hard to to provide more green living and so on. 1995, I would imagine 6 years later, you've got way more bike shops in all these places, but probably still more in Santa Barbara than elsewhere. So anyway, that is the study. And I'm not going to go over this in detail, but this was published. Let's see. So first of all, the Molich and Freudenberg study was published in 2000. The American Sociological Review, same magazine or journal. Two years later, you get a study by Michael Adamson. Michael Adamson is critical of this, and he happens to be at the Marine Science Institute, or at least was at this time, at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail because I actually have not read it as closely, but I'm going to upload it as well, because he's critical of this analysis, and he says that Santa Barbara and Ventura are actually different in a lot of ways, and they don't make good comparisons. For various reasons that have nothing to do with oil development, the cultures look differently. So anyway, it's one of those things. You don't have to read either of them, but you're certainly welcome to, especially if you're interested in these topics, or if you happen to live in this region, maybe you want to live here for a while. And then, of course, the masterpiece. So this was the third chapter of my book, and I don't think I asked you to read the second chapter, where I talk about the history of sprawl and urban development in the United States and suburbanization. But here's where I compare urban growth in Oregon and California. And I should say, before jumping into that comparison, just kind of a more general, we'll get into the PowerPoint, more general things to say about comparisons. So these are all wonderful case studies. Normal accidents looks at a few things, but primarily focuses on the nuclear disaster at 3 Mile Island. Chernobyl looks at the catastrophe in Russia, or what's now Ukraine. Love Canal looks at the ways in which all the looks at the pollution there and the ways in which the government tried to cover it up. I've got a wild animal cat TA here. Anyway, Blowout in the Gulf, also written by William Freudenberg. This is actually the last book that he wrote, and he wanted to, he had cancer and he wanted to finish teaching Intro to Environmental Studies, and he did, and just died like a few days later or something. But it was the first scholarly book that was published on the BP blowout from 2010, and it's short, but it's a pretty good introduction to not only that particular incident, but the broader history of oil drilling off the coast. There's also good documentaries that kind of focus on things. King Corn looks specifically at the corn industry, particularly in Iowa. Gasland is kind of a comparative piece, but does a lot of its focus on the fracking in Pennsylvania, but also looks at Colorado and Texas. But a lot of these works, and there's plenty in the environmental literature canon are case studies, and case studies are great because you learn the deep history of Chernobyl, or what exactly happened when that oil cap blew in the Gulf. However, oftentimes as social scientists, what differentiates some of us from historians who might just do a single history like this, we often add a comparative aspect to it. And so I'll talk about my own city comparisons, but I did something kind of weird and novel for my master's thesis, which was later published in the journal Ethnicities. I did a study of Darfur, Sudan, and I was interested in the genocide that happened there. And it was a case study in that I was looking at this one incident in this one particular place, but it was comparative in the sense that I divided it up into certain time periods. So briefly after decolonization, they become an independent in the 60s, independent nation in the 60s. And then there's a bad drought in the 70s, and that has all sorts of terrible consequences. Then you see sort of a militarization and coup in the 80s, and then you see sort of the formation of these militias around environmental resources and ethnic hatred and so on by the end of the 1990s and early 2000s. And so what I was doing particularly there was comparing the different relations between these different groups at different time periods. So although I was doing a single case study, there was this strong comparative element in it, which when it was published, some of the reviewers, most of the reviewers really liked it. There was one reviewer who begrudgingly accepted it. He said he wasn't sure about that approach, but thought it was still valuable enough. So, c'est la vie. Which means such is life in French. Okay. So when we talk about comparative historical approaches, that means that what we're usually trying to study is the formation of different social institutions or structures or belief systems, things like that. Or in our case, maybe environmental policy development, or environmental activist strategy, or corporate environmental policies that have been effective, or environmental disasters. There's a whole range of things you can think about here. So the comparative aspect means that we're often examining and comparing different structures or processes across countries or regions, or in my case, looking across time, at least in that study on Sudan. And then historical, obviously, emphasizes the historical aspect of it, and that, there's, no matter what, there's always going to be this broad historical context. And it all tries to, understand the complexity and identify causal mechanisms. To give you some idea of how this research can go, you're building theory. And so what I essentially was doing, this sounds like how Leo Tolstoy wrote the book War and Peace, which, by the way, there's a short, 5-minute TED cartoon about it, and it's worth watching just because it's kind of interesting. Anyway, it's similar to how I began my research. So I was interested in sort of ethnic conflict, and particularly, I was 23, and so I was in graduate school and interested in ethnic conflict that was sort of outside the frame of a lot of sociology, which was most ethnic conflict in Africa. So I started looking at Darfur and Sudan, and I began by looking at the sexual violence during war, rape during war. But to do that, I had to understand the ethnic groups. But to really understand the ethnic groups, I had to understand the geography, and then the, the horticulture, and then this and that, and all these customs. And pretty soon, I'm going farther and farther back, and within a few months, I've gone from doing a case study of rape and war to studying that, in addition to this broad history of a genocide, of what was being called at the time the first genocide of the 21st century. And so I was, I kept on widening my approach, while still including the initial interest in sexual violence, and showing that played a role in sort of ethnic division and conflict and so on. Theda Skocpol is a huge figure here in the sociology, and sociology is the main social science, well, I guess political science as well, and anthropology, I suppose, that really uses the historical method. So Theda Skocpol, her huge kind of analysis that broke onto the scene back in, I believe, the 1980s was the States and Social Revolutions, a comparative analysis of France, Russia, and China. If you're familiar with John Thorin in sociology, who also teaches in environmental studies and is very active in climate justice and so on, before he was doing climate justice stuff, he got his start looking at social revolutions, and he did a big case study of them in Iran. Anyway, Skocpol did this study looking at France, 1789, Russia's communist revolution, and China's, and there's a lot of differences between the two, but she found some similarities. She says autonomous state actions will regularly take forms that attempt to reinforce the authority, political longevity, and social control of the state. Even as different as these places were, their societies, their structures, and so on, they had a number of similarities. They all, at least at the time, had kind of a dying feudal dynasty. They also had and even more so, they had a large disenfranchised, peasant and servant class that was increasingly restive and unhappy, discontent with their situations. Other big studies that have been done that are comparative, but kind of within a larger context. Famous one, Ecological Imperialism, the Biological Expansion of Europe, 900 to 1900. This really does a good job of showing how so many different species of animals and plants were spread around the world. My mom was, she lives in Nebraska, and she was surprised when I told her that, palm trees are not native to California. And she was just, what? Because she associates the palm tree with California. No, they're not. None of this stuff pretty much in Santa Barbara is native to California. Anyway, so cultivating the colonies, this also talks about how a lot of the colonial lands, the environments were radically changed for the purposes of resource extraction, growing crops for, to have cheap prices for the British, and so on and so forth. So these are good examples of histories that kind of take on a comparative dimension. Then you've got more modern historical and comparative analyses that look at different environmental policies. They look at the different policies while taking into account the very different social situations in all of these places, and the similarities that we see as well as some of the differences. So this is a pretty broad area right now. There's a lot of comparative analysis happening right now, which is a good thing. When at a time when we're not quite sure which way our institution should go, maybe we should look around and see what institutions are working and what are not. Again, I did research that looked very deeply. I dug very deeply into pastoral societies. By the end of it, before I just realized I had to either learn Arabic or go to Africa, and I wasn't really wanting. Well, I wanted to do both, but my interests were changing at the time to what I'll be talking about in a moment. But by the time I was deeply looking at these ethnic divisions, I was looking at cattle markets and, the cattle prices and who are like the middlemen and so on and so forth. And comparing, and what I was noticing were some of the ways in which Arabs and non-Arabs in this society were being treated. And I say Arabs very loosely because a lot of them were black and from Africa, but culturally identified more as Arabs. But anyway, there's a long analysis that you can read by Eric Nielsen. Anyway, so that's that. Other things, kind of another popular area that probably deserves more research and more comparative analysis is the collapse of complex societies. This is sort of a famous book by Joseph Tainter. The first time I moved to Santa Barbara, I was really into this, and then I became hopeful and optimistic about the potential for for policies. And I shouldn't say that I'm completely pessimistic now, but I also am well aware that we could see a collapse of very complex societies. Nonetheless, Tainter himself says, happily, solving problems by intensifying production and increasing complexity does not always yield catastrophic results, meaning that if we identify, less harmful forms of production, complexity that's not going to confuse everyone, then perhaps we won't, perhaps things won't be quite as bad. Now, you don't need to read all of this. This will just show up in the PowerPoints, but it's basically the definition of a complex society. You have many different institutions. There are a lot of different levels. You've got a lot of different social roles. There's complexity, and the complexity comes from all these different levels in society where people are having to sort of act and interact with each other. So the collapse that often happens is when, some of these societies start to become too complex and, can't manage all these different institutions and organizations. Or when sometimes it becomes too complex too quickly. This can happen as well. So complexity can actually, destroy once stable institutions and organizations. And then pretty soon you start to see less specialization, less centralized control, less trading and production, and you start to see more, more conflict and us versus them groups forming, and so on and so forth. A good book if you're interested in that sort of depressing angle. Dark Age America, Climate Change, Cultural Collapse, and the Hard Future Ahead by John Michael Greer. He's an arch-druid, but he writes very good things about collapse, social collapse, and some other things. He writes other stuff that I've never read, so I can't really speculate on. Anyway. Back to Tainter. So Tainter does this analysis, and his analysis is also a comparative analysis. He compares Mayan civilization, I think it's, am I saying this right, Chacoan civilization. Sorry, long COVID brain here. Chinoan or Chacoan. Anyway, one of the southwestern United States tribes that today would be New Mexico. He also looked at Rome and I believe a couple of other places, and he looked at their collapses, and he identified these 11 primary ways that we see societies collapse. Resource depletion, you have, new resource base comes along, but then there's a catastrophe and insufficient response to circumstance, like a big disease or something. Other complex societies, come along. They start to intrude. You may have class conflict within a society, general social dysfunction, gang warfare, either criminal and or political. Mystical factors. This is something people don't always think about, but this is something I've really become fascinated by, and that's as societies go through periods of, if not collapse, rapid change, you often see a rise in mysticism, whether in religious beliefs or in other types of faith, like, paganism and things like that, the occult, and so on. And so I've been kind of following this stuff just from sort of a sociological view analysis over the last couple of years, and it's been kind of interesting because it really is taking off, and it is sort of an anti, at least not, or a generally non-industrial approach to the new world, and it tends to be, I don't want to say secular, because in many ways it's taking on other aspects we might consider religious, but maybe post-secular, pre-religious or something like that. I don't know. Anyways, we start to see these at times when there's crisis, like when the Roman Empire was hit by a series of pandemics. You saw all these different mystical groups rise up. Chance concatenation of events, a lot of things just occur at the same time. And these tend to, just make things even more complicated and more chaotic and so on. Then you've, of course, got economic factors, which can range from production of goods to importation of needed goods to agriculture and things like that. And he even says, as simple as it is to present this classification, there are still ambiguities. There is much overlap in the categories listed, while some of the themes could be subdivided even further. This is one, kind of look at his collapse. I'll just leave this here for those of you who want to look at the PowerPoint on your own. This is not in the exam at all, but, he kind of talks about, based upon his comparative analysis of these different societies, this is kind of the model that comes from it. Now, I should say there are plenty of people, who are critical of his analysis or this and that part of it. Again, but that's what happens. Somebody's got to make these comparisons first before others can carry on. So again, he's kind of thinking about prior civilizations, what they looked like then versus now. He looked at Mayan culture, as I said. This is southwestern United States, native peoples, and the Mayans. And we believe the Mayans, their empire. Whenever we talk about a society, a civilization collapse, it's not like an overnight thing. Usually it's decades, if not centuries, of decline, of warfare, of bad crops, of, social conflict, natural disaster, climate change, all these different things that can happen. And it usually takes a while for the society to actually decline. One thing that we do see, again, when you look across at a lot of societies that collapse, beyond just Tainter, other people who have done work in this area will often, notice that usually the elites and the powerful are the last ones to realize that the society is about to collapse. Another book that does this on a kind of a more easier to read scale, but definitely influenced by Tainter, was Jared Diamond's book Collapse, where he talks about Australia, and you take a look at Australia here, and it looks wonderful and beautiful, and how could it be in trouble? And a lot of inland Australia is beginning to look like this, and huge devastating fires a few years ago, 2010, this is where what the rainfall looked like. 2016, then you get the horrible drought of 2018 that really, my wife and I think that this essentially where a lot of the koalas are. The fires there made koalas functionally extinct, meaning that basically, left to their own habitat alone, they are probably not able to repopulate. So we'll probably take human effort to help them help the koalas repopulate. So again, you can imagine doing drought analyses, interviewing people back in 2010 about the drought then and the drought in 2016, 2018. You could do like a comparative analysis there. Not you, like for this class. I don't expect you to, to do an interview in Australia. But, in today's Zoomy world, you can more easily. So this is 2018. How are things now? Well, they seem to be headed in the same direction. This is looking from 2018 to 2020, December 2020. Again, very low levels of rainfall, and I don't believe they've had much since then. In that book Collapse, Jared Diamond doesn't just talk about Australia, he also talks about somewhere nearer to at least our home, as in those of us in the United States, the beautiful Montana. Look at Montana here. It's got these, verdant green pine trees and nice water here. Looks so nice you could even drink it, except these moose have probably defecated in it, but these moose are adorable, and so on. The map's all green. Must be fine. No, of course not. Montana also facing a major drought. You see exceptionally dry over here. Where we're talking about the big forest lands. These two moose are probably over here somewhere in the Rockies. Well, how are the Rockies and how is this whole area doing? And you've got Yellowstone over here. Well, not very good. They're exceptionally dry, and everywhere else around them is pretty much extremely dry. And it's exceptionally dry over here as well. So, again, I just wanted to point out there's drought happening everywhere, and people have done comparative studies on it. Like I said, this Collapse, this book came out, 25, no, not even earlier than that, I believe, like 2007 or so, a while ago. But he talks about Australia is in trouble. Australia is going to have a tough time ahead, and here we are 12, 13 years, maybe even 15 years later, and it's unfortunately seems to be playing out according to his predictions, which again were based on a lot of comparisons with past civilizations. So just again, quickly, my own research. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, so I kind of looked at it in different ways. So decided to start out with the bigger state where it's, has more people, more development, California, and I divide it by, megapolitan SoCal, and just talking about how that my focus is going to be on Southern California, where I may mention parts of the northern area. They won't be the main focus, but I do have to talk about, California growth management, and as you see beneath that, I've got a lot of different sections: zoning, the general plan, and I've got, the tax revolt and how that affects development. Then CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, what that meant. exactions and impact fees, which were ways that were developed to raise money, and so on. And so these are looking at different methods, different ways that governments can restrict growth or manage growth at least. And then here I talk about the sample. For a sample of smart growth cities, blah, blah, blah. I go down and talk about San Luis Obispo and, give all these various descriptions. And I believe in my dissertation, not in this book, but in my dissertation, well, I know in my dissertation I've got a table with all of this information that would have probably made it look a bit more clear. But as you see over here, I've got a few paragraphs covering each city, looking at their growth policies, looking at some of their characteristics, and so on. And then I move to the other place, because I'm not just comparing cities within California, because California is a pretty unique state. They've got pretty unique laws. So I decided to look somewhere nearby. Look at Oregon. Oregon's also not representative, because it's got a lot of unique growth management. It's got a lot of interesting growth management aspects to it as well. But the one thing that I did look at, I looked at the history of these various, Senate bills that were passed, urban growth boundaries, and of course you can't talk about urban development and sustainability in Oregon without talking about Portland. So I spent some time talking about them, but then I spent a lot of time talking about these other small suburbs of Portland, and nobody talks about them. Most of the researchers that do research on Portland just, go to the downtown, ride the trains around, and, write about how nice it is. And well, what I did, I stayed with some friends, or I stayed at a hotel, and I not only took trains, but I also rented a car and drove around, because most of the people in Portland commute by vehicle. And so I wanted to, get the full experience of being a Portlandian. Today, I guess I would also have to, go downtown and break stuff and take part in protests and riots and so on and so forth. But this was back when it was, back when it appeared a little bit more peaceful, and you didn't have all of that going on quite yet. So anyway, I looked at these different cities and concluded by kind of talking about how we see these different backgrounds, historical backgrounds, and this plays a role then in how these specific projects that I look at later are then developed. And then that becomes the focus of chapter 4. And remember the use of metaphor. So I've got the smart growth machine. That's where I use that gimmick. Coalitions of entrepreneurs. And I use entrepreneur because that was the hot word from 2010 till, 2020. I guess maybe entrepreneurs is, still a hot thing, but definitely when people like, Mark Zuckerberg and those guys were all still young and not so hated as much. So anyway, I think I'll end it there today and let you get to studying. As I said, just for your own purposes, if you're interested, I will upload these books on Ventura and Santa Barbara and oil development. And as I said, if you're interested, you can take a look at that. The exam, multiple choice, true and false, mostly definitions, some examples of what method you might want to use. So I would look at study table 1.1 in your book and look at the study guide. And feel free to email me if you have any questions. All right, everyone, have a good week.